Hey guys, welcome to another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench brought to you by Highline Guitars. If you like building or repairing electric guitars, I encourage you to tap that subscribe button down below. And if you do, I'll take your luthier skills to a whole new level. In this episode, I'm going to be covering part 12 of the Steampunk guitar build. And if you've been following along, you've probably figured out that part 12 is going to be the final episode in this series. And as you can see, this is not the Steampunk guitar right here. This is one of my other builds that I'm currently working on. But what I'm going to be talking about in this episode is the final assembly and setup of the Steampunk guitar build. And if you'd like to watch the other episodes from this series, at the end of this video, I'll have a link to a playlist that I've created, which will include all 12 parts of the Steampunk guitar build. So without further ado, let's jump in and get started. Before I can do the setup, I need to make a nut. And in this case, I'm going to be making the nut out of brass. So I grabbed some stock that I had on hand and started shaping it with a hacksaw. And since brass is fairly soft, it's easy to shape with a belt sander and a disc sander. Slotting a brass nut isn't really that much different than slotting a bone nut. First thing I have to do is measure and mark the position of the strings. And I usually start by measuring and marking the outside strings, both the high E and the low E. And then from there, I can use a string gauge ruler to determine the spacing of the strings in between. Then I grabbed a thin curved razor saw so I could form the initial slots to position the strings into. And this guitar is using a top loader guitar bridge. And what I like to do is curl the end of the string before feeding it up from the back of the bridge through the saddle. And with all the strings in place, I can check to make sure that I like the spacing. And as you can see here, I've got quite a bit of slotting depth to do. Now the problem is at the bridge, the strings are sitting right on top of the humbuckers, even in their lowest position. So I need to modify the rings. And of course, that means I'm going to have to remove the pickups so that I can sand down those rings to lower the pickups deeper into the body. And I'll use masking tape around the perimeter of the ring as a guide to where I need to sand down to. And then I'm back to the belt sander to sand down the thickness of the bridge humbucker ring. I only had to do the bridge. I didn't need to do the neck humbucker ring. And with everything assembled, you can see I have plenty of space between the bottom of the strings and the top of the humbucker, so I can raise the pickups if I want to. The technique I use for slotting a brass nut is exactly the same as what I use for slotting a bone nut. I just use my usual nut slotting files and cut those slots. And I like to angle the frets files from side to side in order to make that slot ever so slightly wider than the string itself. It just improves the tone and sustain of the string. After the nut has been slotted and I'm happy with the action at the nut, I can go ahead and sand the surface and get it nice and smooth and shiny. And the easiest way to buff it out is just to use a Dremel with a small buffing wheel and some buffing compound. I've had several viewers ask me if I have a Patreon account where they can send money to show support for my YouTube channel. I don't. However, what I do have is a website where you can purchase plans for electric guitars as well as many of the tools that I use to make guitars. It's called eguitarplans.com, and I'll put a link down in the description below. Think of it as a way to show me support while getting something in return. Now let's get back to the video. Originally, I was going to use a maple control cavity cover, which had that faux hammered copper look. However, a viewer suggested that I use a clear acrylic cover instead. So that's what I've decided to go with. Now, of course, that means my Faraday cage isn't going to be a true Faraday cage, but it really doesn't matter because I'm using the single core shielded wire on my lead wires to my controls, so I'm not really worried about outside interference. Now, before doing the final setup, I decided to go ahead and dress the ends of the frets with a very fine dressing file, and that would round over those ends and make them nice and smooth and comfortable to play. Now, you're probably wondering if I've already leveled and recrowned these frets, but I haven't. And the reason I haven't is because I'm relatively confident that it isn't going to be necessary. So I'll go ahead and I'll finish dressing the ends, and then I'm going to hit the top surfaces of the fret with some 500 grit sandpaper, wet dry sandpaper. And then I'll follow up with different grades of synthetic steel wool, starting with a coarse and then working my way up to the really fine. These are the 3M synthetic Scotch-Brite pads. And I'm not going to add a high shine to it. If I wanted to do that, get that really mirror-like shine, I would use my Dremel with the polishing pad, sort of like I did with the brass nut, but I'm not really going to do that. Then I'm going to hit the surface of the fretboard with just a single thin coat or thin application of boiled linseed oil, and I'll let that soak in and dry overnight. The process I follow for doing the setup starts out by checking the electronics to make sure that everything is working correctly. Then I will tune and intonate each string. Once that's done, I will check the action for the strings at the 12th fret, and if necessary, I'll adjust the height of the bridge in order to get the action that I want. Then I'll recheck tuning and intonation to make sure that nothing has changed. Once that's done, I can play each string at each fret to make sure that there isn't any problems with fret buzz, which of course is caused by high frets. If there is, then I know I have to do some spot leveling and recrowning. And if it's bad enough, I'll know I'll have to re-level and recrown all the frets. But in this case, the guitar played perfectly and I didn't need to do any leveling and recrowning work. And that concludes the 12th and final episode in the Steampunk guitar building series. I hope you've enjoyed watching me build this guitar as much as I've enjoyed building it and bringing it to you here on YouTube. And of course, in the future, I plan to post more guitar building projects just like this. So if you don't want to miss anything and you don't subscribe, hit that subscribe button and then be sure to click the bell icon next to it so that you'll be notified every time I post a new guitar building video. So until the next episode, take care and we'll see you soon.